Have you ever truly tried to picture it? A stoic Russian soldier, his face weathered by hardship, singing the melody of Anik, with tears welling unashamedly in his eyes, in a small, dimly lit karaoke bar, somewhere in the vast, sprawling city of Moscow? It sounds unbelievable, doesn't it? Like a scene from a movie that stretches reality too far. But that night it truly happened. In the absolute dead center of a freezing, biting Russian winter, something took place that no one could have possibly expected. A simple song, penned by a Filipino artist named Freddie Aguilar back in 1977. A song about family, about a child, about regret, somehow miraculously bridged two entirely different worlds. Worlds that had, until that moment, never truly understood one another. What if I were to tell you that this single song, and the uniquely vibrant culture that birthed it, is quietly, profoundly transforming Russia today? Not through the loud channels of politics, not through the cold calculations of international business, but through something as simple, as pure, as universally human, as the Filipino love for karaoke. It all began, as these stories often do, with one man, a man named Dmitry Vulov, a 43-year-old Russian engineer from the historic city of St. Petersburg. Before the year 2020, Dmitry had never even heard of the Philippines. He genuinely didn't know where it was on a map. He certainly didn't know what the people there were like. But one day his engineering company sent him to Manila for a 2-year project, an assignment to help design and build a small port system down in Batangas. He expected chaos. He expected suffocating heat. And he expected, if he was honest, a fair bit of confusion. What he did not expect, what he was utterly unprepared for, was the music that seemed to be everywhere. When he first arrived in Manila, Dmitry was immediately struck by how Filipinos seemed to sing constantly, even while they were in the middle of working. He saw construction workers belting out tunes while lifting heavy cement bags. He heard cooks in small carinderias singing ballads while frying eggs. He saw jeepney drivers humming intricate melodies through gridlocked traffic jams. It completely puzzled him. In his homeland in Russia, people simply didn't sing in public like that. Unless, perhaps, they were thoroughly drunk, or celebrating something truly massive like a wedding or a major holiday. But here, in the Philippines, music felt different. Felt like breathing. Essential. Effortless. Constant. One hot Friday evening, after a very long, grueling day at the port site, his new Filipino colleagues invited him out for a karaoke night. He hesitated. The very word, karaoke, sounded childish to him, perhaps even profoundly silly. But, mostly out of politeness, he went along. The place was small. It was colorful. It was wonderfully crowded, buzzing with laughter. There were plastic tables, bright, flickering lights, and a tiny, almost comical stage in the corner. And on that tiny stage, a middle-aged Filipino man was singing, "My Way." Not just singing it, he was living it, with such raw, unfiltered emotion, that the entire noisy room went completely silent for a moment. That was the very first time Dmitry felt something fundamental shift deep inside of him. They sing, like they mean it, he later typed in a message to his wife back in Russia. It's not about talent. It's about heart. And then, inevitably, someone handed him the microphone. The room erupted in cheers. They chanted his name. And before he even knew what was happening, he was standing there, blushing, reading unfamiliar English lyrics off a glowing, pixelated screen. He stumbled. He laughed at himself. He kept going. And when he finally finished, people clapped. Not the polite, reserved applause he was used to, but a genuine, loud, enthusiastic roar. For the first time in a very long while, Dmitry, the quiet engineer, felt truly seen. That night didn't just end with the music. It ended with a powerful, unexpected connection. He stayed until midnight, talking for hours to people he had just met, laughing over shared stories about life, about family, about faith. One of the locals, a jeepney driver named Noel, told him something that night that Dmitry Vulov would never, ever forget. Noel leaned in and said, "Boss, in the Philippines, singing isn't just for fun. It's how we stay alive. Even when life is hard, especially when life is hard, we sing." That single sentence, "It's how we stay alive," haunted him. It echoed in his mind for weeks. Back in Russia, people didn't sing to survive. They drank. They complained. They stoically endured. But they rarely, if ever, celebrated life in such simple, joyful, public ways. Dmitri couldn't stop thinking about it. How could these people, living in conditions far more difficult than many Russians could even imagine, how could they seem so much happier? So much freer? So much lighter? When the global pandemic hit and his port project was suddenly cut short, he returned to Russia with 2 large suitcases, and one very unexpected souvenir, a second-hand beat-up karaoke machine he had bought in a shop in Makati. It was old. It was clunky. But it worked. He didn't realize it then, carrying that heavy box through the airport, but that little clunky machine was about to spark something far, far bigger than he could ever possibly imagine. During those long, isolating, fear-filled months of lockdown in Russia, Dmitri began using that karaoke machine to entertain his family. His teenage daughter sang Taylor Swift. His wife sang old, melancholy Russian love songs. And Dmitri himself, he began the difficult task of learning the Tagalog songs that were still stored in the device's memory. The very first one he managed to memorize was Bakit Ngayon Ka Lang. He couldn't pronounce half the words correctly. But somehow, the melody, it just made sense to him. Felt human. His neighbors, stuck in their own apartments, began hearing the music through the walls. Some of them laughed at first. What is Vulov doing in there? But then, curiosity took over. Soon they joined in, first one then another, bringing snacks and drinks. Every Saturday, a small, bundled-up group gathered in Dmitri's garage. What had started as a simple, private family pastime, slowly turned into something that looked exactly like a Filipino barkada, group of friends, party, but happening in the freezing cold of the Russian suburbs. That is when the fever truly began. Dmitri, just for fun, posted a short video of one of those nights on social media. It showed him and his friends, arms around each other's shoulders, singing Anik, with homemade Russian subtitles typed at the bottom. The video went viral. People across Russia couldn't believe it. Russians, singing Filipino songs? Crying? Hugging? Laughing? This is what we've been missing, one heartfelt comment read. Real joy. But for Dmitri, it was never about going viral. It was about finding something sacred. Something he had clearly seen in the faces of the Filipinos he'd met in Batangas. That incredible, resilient ability to turn their pain into a song. To turn loneliness into shared laughter. To turn daily struggle into a steady rhythm. He told a Russian news station much later, "When I was in the Philippines, I learned that music doesn't need a translation." He paused, then added, "Filipinos taught me that joy isn't about having everything. It's about finding something, anything, to sing for." That single, honest interview sparked a brand new movement all across Russian cities. Karaoke bars in Moscow and beyond started adding Filipino songs to their digital playlists. Tagalog words began popping up on Russian TikTok videos. Even mainstream radio stations started playing Russian-language covers of Anik, Bakit Pa, and Dahil Sayo. And if you think that's just a passing fad, a temporary trend, wait until you hear what happened next. Because when Dmitri's small, humble garage karaoke night turned into a national curiosity, something much deeper, much more profound began to unfold. Something that revealed how the very soul of one small island nation was quietly, gently, warming the frozen heart of the largest country on earth. When the video of Dmitri's garage karaoke night first reached Moscow, the initial reaction was laughter. People thought it had to be a joke. A middle-aged Russian man, singing a sentimental Tagalog song about family and regret? It sounded utterly absurd, almost like a parody. But the laughter started to fade when they watched it more closely. There was just something disarming about it, something undeniably real. You could see the raw emotion in Dmitri's voice. You could see the way he stumbled over the foreign words, but didn't stop. You could hear the people in the background cheering him on, clapping. Not because his performance was perfect, but precisely because it was honest. Soon, journalists started calling it the Filipino warmth in the Russian winter. Local TV stations, curious, wanted to know, how had this tropical nation so far away managed to sneak into the heavily guarded Russian heart, all through a simple karaoke microphone? Dmitri was shy about all the attention, but he finally agreed to appear in one televised interview. Sitting in his modest living room, he spoke softly to the camera. "It started," he said, "in a small noisy bar in Manila. I thought I was just singing. I didn't know I was learning something new, about happiness. From that day forward, karaoke became more than just a pastime in his neighborhood. It became a kind of shared therapy. Retired men who hadn't spoken to their neighbors in years began showing up at his garage clutching cheap microphones. Young people who had grown up glued to the cold glow of their phones suddenly discovered a reason to gather together in person again. There was no competition. There was no stage fright. There was just community. Every song felt like a confession. Every off-key note was instantly, joyfully forgiven. What struck Dmitry the most was how quickly that unique Filipino spirit, that fearless openness, that emotional vulnerability, began to visibly change people. Russians, he knew, were known for their reserve, their deep, stoic silences, their impenetrable pride. But when they started singing these Filipino songs, that emotional armor just cracked. They laughed louder. They hugged longer. And for the first time, many of them said the words, "I love you," to their friends without embarrassment. It reminded Dmitry of something that Noel, the Filipino driver, had told him all that time ago. When you sing in the Philippines, you don't perform. You share. Word of this spread incredibly fast. Karaoke machines started selling out in St. Petersburg and Novosibirsk. Entrepreneurs, sensing a new market, began importing karaoke systems directly from Manila. Systems preloaded with thousands of Filipino classics. Bars began to rebrand themselves with tropical themes. Bamboo walls, halo halo on the menu, and Tagalog lyrics flashing brightly on giant screens. One club in Moscow even changed its name to Bayanihan Nights, after a Tagalog word Dmitry had once heard in Batangas, a word that meant unity and community spirit. But the most surprising part of this story wasn't happening in the big cities. It was happening in a small, remote town in Siberia. A place where the winters could last for half the year, and where temperatures regularly dropped below -30 degrees. There, a young school teacher named Irina Petrovna saw Dmitry's video online. She decided to try karaoke with her students, as a desperate way to fight the intense psychological isolation of the long, dark winter. She downloaded a few Filipino songs, printed out the lyrics phonetically in Russian, and told her students they would sing together once a week after class. The very first song she chose was Tuloy Pa Rin, a Tagalog tune about moving forward, about persevering despite all hardship. At first, just as you'd expect, the students laughed at the strange-sounding words and the upbeat, tropical melody. But then, something happened. The chorus, that hopeful, steady, driving rhythm, it began to stick. They started humming it in the hallways between classes. When Irina asked them why they liked it so much, one quiet, shy boy said, "Because it sounds like sunshine." Within a single month, the entire school was singing it. Parents started joining in. The local radio station even featured them in a small, heartwarming segment they called Warm Songs for Cold Hearts. It became an annual event, a winter concert made up entirely of Filipino music. And then, the Philippine embassy in Moscow heard about it. They reached out to both Dmitry and to Irina, inviting them to participate in a special cultural exchange program. For the very first time, Filipino and Russian singers shared one stage, not as competitors but as humble storytellers. They sang Anik together, as a duet in both Tagalog and Russian, alternating the verses. When the final, poignant note of the song ended, many in the audience simply stood up in stunned silence, before finally, explosively applauding. Some, both Russian and Filipino, were openly crying. It wasn't just about music anymore. It was about understanding. That night, Dmitry realized something even deeper. Karaoke wasn't just an activity. It was a mirror, a reflection of how different cultures choose to deal with life. In the Philippines, he had seen it as a powerful form of resilience, a defiant way of turning pain into celebration. In Russia, he now saw it becoming a vital bridge, a pathway between cold solitude and warm connection. After the concert, an elderly Russian woman, her eyes still wet with tears, approached him. She held his hands tightly in hers and said, "When I sing those Filipino songs, I remember how to smile again." Dmitry didn't know what to say. He just nodded, remembering all the Filipinos he had met, who would sing even during typhoons, who would sing even at funerals. Because to them, he finally understood, music wasn't a denial of reality. It was an act of faith. Soon, major Russian networks began to cover this growing phenomenon. They labeled it the karaoke cure. Psychologists were brought on television, trying to explain why singing these specific songs from the Philippines seemed to measurably boost people's moods, lower their stress levels, and even reduce feelings of loneliness. One prominent psychiatrist said, "These songs, they carry an emotional warmth that our own culture rarely expresses. It's the emotion we have always wanted to show, but never ever dared to." By 2023, there were organized karaoke communities in nearly every major Russian city. People held monthly gatherings, often starting with traditional Russian folk songs, and ending joyfully with Filipino classics. Dmitry Vulov became something of an accidental symbol. Not a celebrity, but a living reminder that profound connection can come from the most unexpected of places. Once, during a live television event, a Russian host asked him, "Dmitry, why do you think Filipinos sing so much?" Dmitry smiled that same gentle smile from the garage. "Because," he said simply, "they trust life." That answer, it stayed with people. Newspapers printed it. Bloggers quoted it. It became the unofficial, unspoken slogan of this entire grassroots movement. Even when it hurts, sing anyway. Meanwhile, back in Manila, a small but growing group of Filipinos started noticing these strange, heartwarming videos coming from Russia. They saw their beloved songs being sung in thick, heavy Russian accents, by people bundled in heavy winter coats, smiling and laughing underneath falling snowflakes. It touched them deeply. "Look at them," one Filipino commenter wrote, "they're singing like us now. From the heart. We gave them a piece of our soul." What had begun as a single night of awkward curiosity in a small Manila karaoke bar, had somehow, impossibly, turned into a genuine cultural embrace between two nations that had, throughout history, rarely ever shared a meaningful conversation. But as this musical movement spread even wider, something totally unexpected was about to happen. Something that would test whether this newfound connection was just a fleeting, superficial trend, or something truly powerful enough to redefine how two very different peoples could finally, truly understand each other. By the time the year 2024 arrived, something truly extraordinary was happening all across the vast expanse of Russia. From the capital in Moscow to the northern port of Murmansk, from seaside cafes in Sochi to frozen village halls in deepest Siberia, people were singing. And not just any songs. They were singing Filipino songs. Songs about love, about loss, about forgiveness, about unwavering faith. Songs that carried an intangible warmth so deep, so profound, it felt like it could melt through even the coldest, darkest nights. It all built toward one singular, unforgettable event, the Harmony Festival. It was organized jointly by the Russian Ministry of Culture and the Philippine Embassy. The official goal was simple: celebrate the growing friendship between the two nations through the shared language of music. But for Dmitry, it was so much more than that. It was the culminating moment. The moment he had to confront what this entire accidental journey had truly meant for him and for the country he loved. The festival was held, of all places, in Red Square, under a grand dome of twinkling winter lights. For the very first time in Russian history, Tagalog lyrics flashed across giant LED screens, right beside their Russian translations. Thousands of people gathered in the freezing cold. Families, veterans, students, even Orthodox priests. Some inexplicably waved small Philippine flags. Others held up their own microphones in the frigid air, ready to sing along. It felt completely, beautifully surreal. When Dmitry Vulov finally stepped onto the massive stage, he was not alone. Behind him stood Irina Petrovna and her Siberian students, now famously known nationwide as the Snow Choir. They were all dressed in colorful barongs and Turno-inspired outfits, a heartfelt gift from the Filipino community living in Moscow. Before the performance began, Dmitry looked out at the massive crowd, and he took a long, deep breath. He remembered that first night all those years ago in that small, sweaty Manila bar, the chaotic laughter, the overwhelming warmth, the passionate voices that didn't care one bit about perfection. He realized in that moment that what he had witnessed back then wasn't just a culture of singing. It was a culture of hope. The music started softly. The first song, of course, was Anik. Dmitry sang the opening verse in haunting, perfect Russian. Arena students followed, their young, clear voices singing the next verse in Tagalog. Their voices blended together in a way that felt almost spiritual, like a prayer floating up between two worlds. People in the audience began to sing along. Some hesitantly at first, mouthing the strange words, then louder and freer, until the entire historic square echoed with the sound of thousands of voices, united in song. Midway through the song, Dmitri noticed an elderly Filipino man, standing right in the front row, clutching a small, worn rosary. Tears were streaming down his weathered face. After the performance, Dmitri found him backstage. The man introduced himself as Ernesto, a retired Filipino seaman who had lived in Vladivostok for over 30 years. "When I first came here," Ernesto said, his voice thick with emotion, "no one knew my language. No one knew my home. Tonight, everyone sang it." He looked at Dmitri and whispered, "You have no idea what that means." Those words, they pierced something deep inside Dmitri. He thought about all the thousands of nameless Filipinos who had worked so quietly in Russia over the years. Caregivers, engineers, musicians, teachers, all of them carrying their songs like hidden, precious treasures. And now, those very songs had become part of the Russian voice itself. That night didn't just unite two cultures. It healed something invisible. Russians, who had for so long lived with a sense of collective, historic heaviness, suddenly discovered what Filipinos had somehow known all along. That joy isn't the absence of pain, but the profound courage to sing right through it. After the final performance, long after the crowds had gone, Dmitri walked alone through the quiet, snow-covered streets of Moscow. The air was freezing, his breath visible in the cold light of the street lamps. Yet he felt a strange, persistent warmth deep in his chest. He passed by a small underground bar, and from deep inside he heard someone singing Bake Pa in a thick, joyful Russian accent. He heard people laughing, clapping, cheering. He smiled to himself, and walked on. A week later, he was invited to speak at a university in St. Petersburg. The topic, Cultural Resilience Through Music. Standing in front of hundreds of young, curious students, he shared his journey, not as a performer or a star, but as a humble student of the Filipino spirit. "Filipinos taught me," he said, his voice resonating with gentle authority, "that music is not a luxury. It's survival. It's how you keep your heart open, when life tries so hard to close it." One student raised her hand and asked, "Do you think Russians can ever love like that? Can we ever truly sing like that?" Dmitri paused, considering the question deeply. Then he said, "We already are." His answer wasn't about music. It was about a nation rediscovering its emotional core. For decades, Russia had been a place of endurance, strong, proud, famously stoic. But now, through a simple microphone imported from Manila, it had found something softer, something perhaps truer. Soon after, videos of the Harmony Festival spread worldwide. Filipino media picked up the story, calling it the warmest winter in Russia. Social media exploded with clips of Russians singing Tadhana, Pusong Bato, and Nandito Ako with astonishing, heartfelt sincerity. In one viral video, a group of Russian soldiers stationed near the Arctic Circle sang Bayan Ko together, while standing in the deep snow. Their voices cracked with raw emotion. When asked why they chose that song, one of them said, "Because it sounds like home, even if it's not ours." Back in Manila, people watched in stunned disbelief. "Imagine that," one popular radio host said, his voice full of wonder. "Our songs, our karaoke, have reached Russia. And they sing it just like we do, from the heart. We gave them a piece of our soul." Even the Philippine president mentioned it during a cultural diplomacy speech. "We have shared many things with the world," he said, "but perhaps none as powerful as our unique ability to turn hardship into harmony. Through music, the Filipino soul has found a new home in Russia." For Dmitri, that was the moment he realized his unlikely journey had truly come full circle. What had begun as a single, awkward, polite karaoke night had somehow blossomed into a genuine cultural movement. One that reminded him of something deeply universal, that no matter where we come from, what language we speak, or what God we worship, we all share the same fundamental human longing, to be heard, to belong, and to feel joy, despite the storms. On the one-year anniversary of the Harmony Festival, Dmitri returned to the Philippines for the first time since his project had ended years ago. He visited that very same karaoke bar in Batangas, the one where it had all begun. It hadn't changed much. Still small. Still wonderfully noisy. Still packed and full of life. When his turn came, he chose a song he had once completely butchered in broken English, "My Way." But this time as he sang, his voice was steady. Not perfect, never perfect, but filled with something infinitely deeper. The locals clapped, smiling and cheering at the familiar sight of this tall Russian man who sang just like one of them. After the song, the bartender, the very same man from all those years ago, leaned over the counter and said, "You sing much better now, boss." Dmitri laughed. "I learned from the best," he replied. But as he looked around that small, crowded room, filled with strangers who somehow felt like family, he understood something he hadn't truly grasped before. The real gift wasn't the music itself. It was the humanity that came with it. The quiet reminder that sometimes what the broken, divided world needs most is not another policy, not another political deal, but simply another song. And that song, born in the warm islands of the Philippines, had miraculously found its way to the very heart of Russia. A few months after his return trip to the Philippines, Dmitri received a letter in the mail. The envelope was postmarked from St. Petersburg, written in neat, Cyrillic handwriting. Inside was a single photograph. It showed a group of small children standing outside their school in the deep snow, all of them holding microphones made from cardboard. Behind them, someone had painted a large banner that read, "Salamat Filipinas." Thank you, Philippines. He held that picture for a long, long time. In their bright, joyful smiles, he saw something achingly familiar, that very same unconquerable joy he had first seen, all those years ago in the faces of Filipinos singing under the warm Manila night. Except now, that same joy was reflected back at him, thousands of miles away, in the absolute middle of a Russian winter. He realized then that the story wasn't his anymore. It belonged to everyone. To everyone who had ever picked up a microphone, afraid but willing. To everyone who had ever sung just to feel alive. To everyone who had ever believed that a simple song could somehow heal what mere words could not. When Dmitri returned to Russia later that year, he noticed how much had truly changed. On a quiet Sunday morning as he walked through his own city, he passed a small cafe with new bamboo decorations. Inside, a young Russian couple was singing a duet of Forevermore. Two elderly women were sitting nearby, clapping along. Outside, snow was falling heavily, but the windows of the cafe were fogged with warmth. It was subtle, but it was everywhere. The Filipino influence wasn't loud or political. It didn't need to be. It had seeped, gently like warmth, into the fabric of daily life, into shared laughter, into spontaneous song, into the very rhythm of ordinary, everyday moments. And in a country long known for its history of stoic endurance, that small, simple dose of joy had become nothing short of revolutionary. Dmitri began writing about it. He called his collection of essays, "The Warmth from the Islands." They weren't about music per se, but about the deep, emotional shift he had personally witnessed, how this simple act of shared singing had somehow made people kinder, how it had reawakened a dormant empathy. His words began to spread, translated into blogs, quoted in interviews. And one particular line became especially famous. "The Filipinos didn't just give us songs. They reminded us that the soul survives best when it sings." Across the vastness of Russia, more and more communities joined the wave. Churches began hosting karaoke nights as a new, joyful form of fellowship. Hospitals started using karaoke therapy to lift the spirits of their patients. Even some prisons adopted it as a novel rehabilitation program. Psychologists called it the Filipino effect, the astounding ability of shared music to create a sense of true belonging where there was once only profound isolation. But for Dmitri, the true, irrefutable proof of that deep transformation came quietly, unexpectedly, one evening. He was visiting a small orphanage near Kazan, where volunteers now organized karaoke sessions for children who had lost their families. The very first song the children chose wasn't a Russian tune. It was Tuloy Pa Rin. As they sang, Dmitri noticed one little boy about 7 years old, singing louder than anyone else, smiling so wide his eyes nearly disappeared. Afterward, Dmitri quietly asked the caretaker about him. The woman said, "He doesn't talk much. He is very quiet. But when he sings that song, he laughs. He says it makes him feel brave." That one word, brave, stayed with Dmitri all night. It reminded him powerfully of the Filipinos he had first met, that same unbreakable resilience that lived within their laughter, the amazing grace that somehow colored even their deepest pain. Some months later, the Philippine ambassador invited him to another special event in Moscow. A tribute this time called Songs Without Borders. It featured Filipino and Russian performers sharing the same stage once more. When Dmitri arrived, he was surprised to see hundreds of people. Diplomats, artists, ordinary families, all holding small unlit candles. The lights in the hall dimmed, and a Filipino choir began to sing the prayer. Then, halfway through, the entire audience joined in, some in English, some in Tagalog, some in Russian. In that magical moment, all the languages just melted away. There was no east or west, no cold or tropical, no difference that mattered. Just one single sound. Human, sincere, eternal. As the final note faded into silence, Dmitri felt tears rolling down his own face. Not from sadness, but from a strange, overwhelming gratitude. The kind of gratitude that completely humbles you. He realized then that the Philippines had not only taught Russia how to sing again, it had reminded the entire world what singing was truly for. It wasn't about performance. It was about presence. It wasn't about showing off. It was about showing up, for life, for each other, for the fragile, sacred beauty that connects us all. In his closing speech that night, Dmitri said something simple but unforgettable. Filipinos, he said, his voice thick, taught us that singing is another form of prayer. You don't need to understand every single word. You just have to feel it. And when you do, you realize you've never been alone. The audience stood in complete silence for a long moment, before finally applauding. Not the loud, echoing kind, but a soft, heartfelt, unified applause that seemed to last forever. After that night, Dmitri's story became part of modern Russian folklore. In schools, children learned about the karaoke bridge between Russia and the Philippines. Documentaries were made, songs were recorded, and people began calling the phenomenon the sound of warmth. When foreign phrase, find my life. And back in Batangas, in that same small karaoke bar, the one where it all began, the owner hung a framed photo on the wall. It showed Dmitri on stage in Red Square, surrounded by children, singing a Tagalog song underneath falling snow. Below it, a small handwritten note from the owner read, "Wherever there is music, there is home." Today, when Russians pick up a microphone and sing a Filipino song, they're not just singing notes. They're echoing a profound lesson from a distant tropical island. That faith can sound like laughter, that resilience can rhyme with melody, and that joy, when it is shared, has absolutely no borders. So the next time you hear someone singing Anik in a language you don't understand, stop and listen. Somewhere, hidden in those unfamiliar words, is the very heartbeat of a people who taught the world that even when life gets incredibly hard, there is always a reason to sing. Because the Philippines didn't just give the world karaoke. It gave us something far greater. It gave us the courage to find light in every single song.